And this is where it gets personal, where they want to dictate things like IVF and reproductive care. I remember those waiting for the phone calls. You'd go through the treatments. I would have my neighbor come over to have to give shots to my wife and things like that. And the phone would ring, and you would just hope so highly that it would be good news. And then when you found out the treatments didn't work, it was a darkness that could blot out the sun.
That was Kamala Harris's running mate, Tim Walz, sharing how he and his wife, Gwen, sought fertility treatments when trying to have children, a narrative that has become central to him on the trail. Fortunately, it's not exactly true. In a profile in Glamour magazine published earlier this week, Minnesota First Lady Gwen, his wife, shared more details about the family's fertility story, clarifying that they did not use in vitro fertilization, but rather IUI, or intrauterine insemination, which is a different process from IVF. It does not involve implicating embryos the way that IVF does.
J.D. Vance immediately started targeting Walz, accusing him of lying. He took to X, writing, quote, "Today it came out that Tim Walz had lied about having a family via IVF. Who lies about something like that?" The Harris-Walz spokesperson issued a statement explaining the governor was, quote, "using only commonly understood shorthand for fertility treatment." IVF was thrust into the spotlight after the Alabama Supreme Court ruled embryos should be treated like children, rendering IVF a possible criminal offense. So
yes, IVF, but not IUI. So the difference is important, especially to someone who went through it. He said on MSNBC last month, "Thank God for IVF. My wife and I have 2 beautiful children." Again, I think this is another clear case, like the military case, where he implied or suggested something contrary to what actually is. And this is becoming a little bit of a pattern with him. They are very different procedures from the standpoint of a Christian or socially conservative morality. People who object to IVF don't object to IUI because it doesn't involve the creation or destruction of embryos. So there are Christian conservative people in this country who would object to one but not the other. So conflating them, sure, maybe there are some people who use IVF as shorthand for both things, but if we're talking about policy, it's very different, and he should know that from having gone through it. And he absolutely allowed people to believe that, again, his story specifically concerns IVF. My children wouldn't exist if not for this thing that Republicans are trying to ban, when really they did a different procedure. Again, it's not the end of the world, but he ought to be a little bit more careful in the ways he says things. There is now a clear pattern of him exaggerating, if not outright lying or misleading the public and the media, and they're covering for it. There's no one hounding him over these kinds of misstatements in the mainstream media, as far as I can tell. It's all excuses for him.
Yeah, I don't think it's a big difference whether or not he had an embryo outside of his wife's body that was fertilized, or if they conducted the procedure through, taking the sperm and injecting it into the eggs within the uterus. They still use this fertility technology that colloquially people call IVF.
Well, you might not think it's a big difference, but the millions of conservative people in the country do think it is.
Ridiculous they find it a big difference as well, that the embryo is outside of the body and therefore it's a bigger deal, because frequently, even through natural physical conception via sex, you have embryos or eggs that are fertilized that don't attach to the uterine wall. Is that woman responsible for murder because the natural process of the embryo implanting on her uterine wall doesn't go right? That's the same thing.
The problem, and again, I'm just explaining how socially conservative people feel about this. Their problem, I'm not speaking from my own personal attitude, but the way Christian conservative people feel is that IVF involves the creation, fertilization of additional embryos that are then that are left over and discarded, and nothing is done with them. And their view is that is potential life, and that part of it is wrong.
And that's what I'm saying, is that happens naturally all the time. You can have someone's sperm inside of you and it fertilizes an egg that does not implant. That is an embryo that ends up dying. Is that woman responsible for murder for that embryo not implanting in her uterus? That happens all the time.
Yeah, again, I'm not.
I think it's so. That's why I think it's ridiculous that that's even like a view that people have, because it seems to be one that's not based on science or reality. And so these people that are, assessing Walz's military record after 24 years of service, that he retires 4 years later than what is standard, that he did deploy in support of the war in Afghanistan, which is how he said it several times, which is very precise language for a veteran to use. And because he made a point about gun control and mentioned guns, it seems like J.D. Vance has nothing to
carried in war. I mean,
he carried to war. He deployed in support of the war in Afghanistan, which is how he himself put it. I've read many op-eds by veterans who talk about this and say Walz has always been very precise about this, and they think it's petty of someone like J.D. Vance, who is essentially in the role of being a war reporter when he deployed. And he's saying, oh, well, I served our country during Afghanistan. He took photographs and wrote articles. That is what he did. Walz was of a much higher position and was actually supporting the strategy of the war. He wasn't just reporting on it like
petty.
Vance.
Okay, excuse me. That's equally petty. Neither of them were in combat, and that's relevant.
I think it's relevant to point out that J.D. Vance was taking pictures and reporting on the war while Tim Walz's position.
Is that not a commendable?
No, thank you for your service, J.D. Vance.
We're journalists
let's be very real. That is a very different contribution in terms of what the substantiality of the contributions were than Tim Walz, who's in a very high-ranking position, was contributing actually to strategy.
Okay, he still should not have made it sound like he was in combat. And if people continue to find it suspect that he got out right before his unit was going to be deployed to Iraq, they can draw whatever conclusion about that they want. I think he has a clear pattern of we haven't even, really talked about the drunk driving allegation against him yet. It seems like that was totally misrepresented as well, that he claimed it's been sort of hushed up, barely dealt with by the media, that he was pulled over for drunk driving many, many, many years ago, and he claimed it was having to do with his eyesight. It absolutely was not. It had to do with drunkenness.
Yeah, what happened there was he was young, and I believe in his 20s. He was pulled over.
Okay, fine.
He was found to have had a few beers, very common occurrence in the Midwest. He told the cop that he was deaf and tried to get off on that. But following that, he got sober, and that was the event in his life that motivated him to get sober. And so, yeah, of course the right's not going to attack him on that, because that's an endearing story and one many people can relate to with family members who are alcoholics in the U.S. So it feels like J.D. Vance has nothing really to campaign against and is splitting hairs instead. And I think it makes J.D. Vance look even more unlikable. I think this is why he just keeps going down in the favorability ratings. His attacks aren't landing, and they're making him look worse. The data supports that.
I don't know that they're not landing. I mean, you can make the argument, I guess, that they're not. I don't know that they're not landing. Conservative media has been all over these claims by these aspects of Tim Walz's identity. They're doing the work the mainstream media absolutely refuses to do, properly vetting this candidate. I don't know. I think given the policy debate around IVF particularly, not being more precise in your language here was, I guess not an unforgivable sin, but an error, and one he should correct when he talks about this in the future. These are different things. Religious people want to ban one, but not the other generally for deeply and sincerely held reasons. You don't have to agree with those reasons. I know you don't. I'm not saying that I necessarily do, but that is how millions of people feel. And it's a public policy matter that's going to come up, and he was involved in it and should represent his history related to it correctly.
I think when many people are struggling to afford groceries and one party's putting forth a plan to end price gouging and talking about that, and J.D. Vance is obsessing over the technical language Walz uses, I think it signals to the American people, who has the interests of regular working Americans at heart and who just wants to campaign for power, considering J.D. Vance has changed all of his positions since he was a student at Yale Law School. He just is a fraud and a phony to me, and I'm just sick of him being in the media. I can't wait till J.D. Vance loses this election and Trump blames it all on him and we never have to hear about him again.
I feel that way about Tim Walz, while also not being, you're a fan of Tim Walz and you hate J.D. Vance. I'm not particularly a fan of J.D. Vance, but I also do not like Tim Walz. I do not want to see his policies become part of the federal government. I absolutely do not want to see the price gouging thing go into effect that is going to result in shortages, as they have every other time they were tried, including in America under the Nixon presidency. There's exhaustive economic literature against doing price controls, but...
That's not the same thing. Price controls and price gouging laws are different. There's price
Price
gouging laws
gouging
in
is
40
an
states
example
today.
of price controls.
There's price gouging laws in 40 states today, including conservative states.
We should not have them.
But they haven't created shortages.
Of
and
course
haven't,
they have.
No, they haven't.
They
The
always
price
do.
gouging laws in the 40 states we have, no, they have not.
They always do, yes.
No.
Yes.
Just give an example of one state with price gouging laws in the United States where shortages have been created, Robbie.
If we didn't have those laws, you would have more supply of those goods. It's just basic.
What evidence do you have of that claim, Robbie?
Basic economics 101.
That's
when
not
you
evidence.
when you
Unless you
discourage
can
people, when you
point
stop
to a
people
time where it's
from offering a service at the price they want to offer it for, you're going to get less of that thing.
No. So an example
Yes,
would
you
be
just are.
No. An example of this would be in hurricanes. There were issues in southern states like Texas and Florida
Yes.
and Louisiana where companies, corner stores and the like, were charging.
Usually not big corporations, by the way. I know you love to rail against corporations, but the
Big
people who
corporations
spike their
yes.
prices in emergencies are the local people, not the corporations.
Yes, but what we're dealing with during the pandemic is big corporations. But in Texas, they made laws that you can't charge $10 for a water bottle in a time of crisis. That did not create shortages. What creates shortages
Yes, it does.
is water being too expensive for people to afford it. That is why we need price gouging
are
laws.
are not allowed to sell it at what the market is willing to pay for it, they just hoard it. They don't sell it.
That's not true. There's
Yes,
no
it is.
examples of that happening in any of these states after a hurricane.
Absolutely true. Well, we'll have to look at that more closely. More Rising right after this.